I knelt at my father's casket and I cried. Not loud, not for show, just tears landing on wood that still smelled faintly of sawdust from a workshop he never got around to finishing. My wife leaned down close enough that only I could hear her and said two words, "Grow up." Her brother laughed behind his hand. Her mother adjusted her pearl bracelet like nothing in the room had happened at all. Nobody in that family said a word to stop any of it. They just watched me the way you watch a stain spread across white linen, embarrassed, waiting for someone else to handle it. I didn't say anything back. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked my father to his grave like a man who'd learned, a long time ago, that some humiliations get swallowed quietly, in front of an audience, because making a scene would only prove their point. But I want to tell you what happened in the 3 weeks after that day. Because the funeral isn't what broke my marriage. It was the silent car ride home. That's where I finally heard what 12 years of marriage had been quietly telling me, if I'd only been willing to listen. My name doesn't matter much in this story. What matters is the man who raised me. Walter, a transmission mechanic who worked the same shop for 31 years and never once told me something he didn't mean. He raised my younger sister and me alone after our mother left when I was 6. He never badmouthed her, not once. Not even when I was old enough to ask hard questions about why she left. He just rolled up his sleeves, learned how to braid my sister's hair out of a library book, and showed up. Every recital, every parent-teacher conference, every fever at 2 in the morning. He worked the overnight shift for years so he could be home during the day, and he never once made it sound like sacrifice, though I understand now that it was, every single day of it. My father believed that feeling something all the way through wasn't weakness. He told me that exact sentence when I was 9 years old, skin knee, crying in the garage where nobody else could see me cry. Let it out, son. All the way out. A man who can't feel right can't love right either. I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. I understood it fully, completely, on the day I buried him. I met my wife, Diane, when I was 26, at a mutual friend's wedding. She was the kind of beautiful that made you lose your sentence halfway through saying it. She came from money. Old money, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that owns a lake house nobody calls a vacation home, and keeps a family lawyer on speed dial for reasons that are never quite explained. Her father had passed years before I came along, and her mother, Eleanor, ran that family the way a conductor runs an orchestra, precise, composed, and absolutely unwilling to tolerate an instrument playing out of turn. I fell for Diane hard and fast. I fell for the way she used to laugh with her whole face, before she learned, somewhere along the way, to laugh with just her mouth instead. I fell for the version of her that still existed before her family's expectations closed back around her, slow and certain, like a hand closing around something it had only briefly let go of. We got married in a backyard, no caterer, just folding chairs and string lights. My father walked me down the aisle because my mother wasn't in the picture and somebody had to. For a few years, it really was good. It was real, in the way that doesn't need explaining to anyone outside of it. But marriages don't usually break in dramatic moments. They erode in small ones, the kind you forgive so quickly you don't notice you're keeping score. A comment about my father's old pickup truck at Thanksgiving. An eye roll when I mentioned growing up working weekends at his shop. A joke about people who talk with their hands. That got a laugh from her side of the table, and I laughed too, because making a scene would have cost more than staying quiet. I started editing myself before I even walked into rooms with her family, deciding, before I opened my mouth, which parts of me were allowed inside. My father noticed before I did. He always did. One Sunday, fixing a fence post in his backyard, sweat on his collar, he looked over at me and said, "You're quieter around her people. You used to talk with your hands when you told a story." I laughed it off, told him I was just tired. But driving home that night, I kept hearing it. "You used to talk with your hands." I didn't know yet that the loudest, most honest parts of me were the ones I'd already started burying, slowly, politely, years before I'd ever have to bury him. There's a word Diane's family uses a lot. Composure. Eleanor said it to Diane the way other mothers say, "Be careful," or "I love you." A constant, low hum underneath every conversation. Composure at the dinner table. Composure when the stock market dipped, and composure when it didn't. Composure when Diane's cousin got divorced, and the family discussed it over wine like a weather pattern moving through, something to be monitored, never wept over. I used to joke, in the early years, that I'd married into a family that treated emotion the way other families treated a relative with a drinking problem. Present, acknowledged in passing, never invited to sit at the actual table. I remember the Christmas, maybe 4 years into our marriage, when my father's shop almost closed. 31 years, and a corporate buyout nearly ended it in a single afternoon. I told Diane in the car on the way to her mother's house, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. She reached over, squeezed my hand once, and said, "We'll figure it out. Just, let's not bring it up tonight, okay? Mom's got the Hendersons coming." I understood what she meant without her needing to finish the sentence. Don't bring your real life into this house. Leave it in the car. So I did. I sat at that table and laughed at Bradley's jokes about people who work with their hands for a living, bless their hearts. Not knowing he was describing my father, not knowing, or maybe not caring. I excused myself to the bathroom once that night, just to put my hands on a marble countertop and breathe, the way you do when you're trying to keep something down that wants to come up. This was the pattern for years. Not cruelty. Exactly. Cruelty would have been easier to name, easier to fight. This was something quieter. A constant, gentle redirection away from anything that looked like real feeling. When my sister's marriage fell apart and I cried telling Diane about it over the phone, she got quiet, then said, "I just don't know what to do when you get like this." Get like this. Like emotion was a fever I should take medicine for. I started to notice I was two different men. The one who showed up to Diane's family events, careful, composed, agreeable, laughing at jokes that cut a little. And the one who drove out to my father's garage on Saturday mornings, hands deep in some engine that didn't need fixing, just so I could talk to him the way I used to talk before I learned which version of myself got invited places. My father never said a bad word about Diane. Not once in all those years. But he'd watch me sometimes, mid-sentence, the way you watch someone you love walking toward a door you're not sure they should walk through. Once, just once, he said, "You know you can still be soft and be a man, right?" Nobody ever told you that wasn't true, did they? I told him nobody had to tell me. I just hadn't been around people who needed reminding. He nodded slowly, the way he did when he decided not to push something further, and went back to his fence post, and I went back to pretending I hadn't heard the worry underneath his question. That was the year his cough started. The one we both ignored for longer than we should have, because neither of us were the kind of men who made a fuss over our own bodies. I didn't know yet that the fuss was exactly what was needed. I didn't know how little time there was left to learn that lesson properly, the way he'd always tried to teach me, with his sleeves rolled up and his hands never quite clean. The cough turned into something with a name 8 months before he died. Stage 4, the kind of diagnosis that doesn't leave room for the soft language doctors usually reach for. My father took the news the way he took everything. Quiet, steady, already thinking about logistics instead of grief. Asking the oncologist practical questions about timelines like he was scheduling a transmission repair instead of the end of his own life. I became his ride to chemo, his grocery runner, the one who sat in waiting rooms with magazines I never read, scrolling through nothing on my phone just to have somewhere to put my eyes. Diane came twice. Twice in 8 months. Both times she sat stiffly in the corner of his small living room like the furniture might be contagious, checked her phone more than she looked at him, and left earlier than she arrived. I told myself she was just uncomfortable around illness. Some people are. I told myself a lot of things that year to keep from asking the question underneath all of them. Once, after her second visit, I overheard her on the phone with a friend in the driveway, saying, "It's just a lot, you know. Hospitals aren't really my thing." As if my father dying were an inconvenient genre of movie she'd accidentally rented instead of the man who'd walk me down the aisle at my own wedding. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone, was how much I was unraveling. I'd leave my father's house at 11 at night, sit in my car in his driveway, and just put my forehead against the steering wheel for 10 minutes before I could drive home. I never cried in front of him. He'd taught me that feeling something all the way through wasn't weakness, but somewhere along the way I decided that applied to everyone except me when it came to him. I thought staying strong for him meant staying dry-eyed. I think now I had it backward. I think he would have wanted me to let him see it. One night, near the end, he was thinner than I'd ever seen a person get, and still be talking, still be making jokes about the nurse's shoes. He looked at me and said, "You've gotten quiet again, son. Quieter than even with her people." I told him I was just tired. He didn't believe me. I could tell, but he let it go, The way you let go of an argument you know you don't have the strength left to finish. I went home those nights to a wife who'd ask, "How's your dad?" The way you'd ask about traffic. Not unkind, just removed, like she was checking a box. I started answering, "Fine," even when nothing about it was fine, because the real answer required a kind of presence I'd stopped expecting from her, and asking for it and not receiving it had become its own particular kind of exhausting. There's a specific loneliness in carrying grief next to someone who won't pick up any of the weight. You don't get the relief of being alone, where at least the silence is honest. You get the silence of being witnessed and still unseen, which is worse, somehow. I didn't have a word for it then. I do now. I just didn't have anyone to say it to, which was, in its own way, the whole point of what was happening to my marriage, even if I wasn't ready to call it that yet. I'd lie awake some nights doing the math on it. 8 months, 2 visits, 100 small moments I'd quietly decided not to count against her, until the counting did itself anyway, somewhere underneath where I could see it. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, with me holding his hand and the nurse quietly stepping out to give us the room. His last clear sentence to me, 2 days before, was, "Don't let anybody tell you feeling things makes you small. It's the only thing that ever made me big." I've turned that sentence over in my hands more times than I can count since then, like a stone I keep in my pocket. The funeral was at the small Lutheran church he'd attended for 30 years, the kind with creaky pews and a pastor who actually knew him, who told a story about my father fixing his car for free during a bad winter and refusing to take a dime for it. Diane's family came. All of them, dressed in expensive black, sitting 2 rows back like they were attending something they'd RSVP'd to rather than mourning someone they'd actually known. To be fair, they barely had known him. That was its own quiet failure of mine. Looking back, how little I'd ever let those 2 worlds touch. When they lowered the casket, something in me just broke open. I knelt down at the edge of the grave, and I cried the way I hadn't let myself cry in 8 months of waiting rooms and silent driveways. Ugly, full-body crying, the kind that comes from a place you've been bracing against for a long time. I wasn't performing grief. I was finally releasing it. That's when Diane leaned down, her hand gripping my shoulder too hard to be comforting, and said it. "Grow up." Quiet enough that the pastor didn't hear. Loud enough that her brother Bradley did. And he laughed. Actually laughed. A short, surprised bark of a sound he tried to disguise as a cough, and didn't quite manage. Eleanor, 3 feet away, didn't even flinch. She adjusted her sunglasses and looked toward the parking lot, like she was already thinking about lunch reservations. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to. I just remember my knees finding their way back under me, my hands finding the buttons of my jacket, my face finding whatever blank expression I'd spent years perfecting for rooms exactly like this one. I shook the pastor's hand. I thanked people for coming. I did every single thing a composed man is supposed to do at his father's funeral, and the entire time, something inside my chest was quietly, permanently rearranging itself. The car ride home was 11 minutes. I know because I counted the streetlights instead of speaking. Diane finally broke the silence around streetlight number 7. "You embarrassed yourself back there," she said, not looking at me. "I was trying to help you not embarrass yourself further." I didn't respond. I just kept driving, watching the road, replaying my father's voice from 2 days earlier. The only thing that ever made me big. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand in 12 years of marriage. My wife did not see my heart as something to protect. She saw it as something to manage. And there's a difference between those two things wide enough to lose an entire life inside of. I sat in the driveway after she'd already gone in, engine off, hands still on the wheel, and I thought about every time I'd called that managing love because I didn't have a better word for it. And because the alternative, naming it correctly, would have cost me more than I was ready to pay. I didn't go home again that night, not really. I told Diane I needed to go check on my father's house, make sure it was locked up, and she didn't argue. I think some part of her was relieved to have the space. I drove the 15 minutes to the house I grew up in, let myself in with the spare key under the fake rock by the porch, the same hiding spot since I was 9 years old, and just stood in the hallway for a long time, breathing in motor oil and coffee and the particular smell of a house that had loved one person quietly for 30 years. I went into his bedroom, which I'd avoided all through his illness because it felt like trespassing on something private even while he was alive. On his nightstand was a worn spiral notebook I'd never seen before. Inside, in his blocky mechanic's handwriting, were entries. Not a diary exactly. More like notes to himself, the way he'd jot down torque specs or part numbers. Except these were about me. About my sister. Dated over years. One entry, from 3 years back, read, "Watched my boy go quiet again at his in-laws today. Didn't say anything. Wanted to. Some things a father can see that a son can't yet." Another, more recent, near the back. "If anything happens to me before I get the chance to say this properly, feeling things isn't the disease, son. Hiding them is. Don't marry a silence. Build a life with someone who lets you be loud when you need to be loud." I sat on the edge of his bed and read that sentence maybe 20 times. I'm not going to pretend a notebook changed my entire life in one sitting. That's not how this works, not in real life. But it gave language to something I'd been carrying for years without a name. I'd been editing myself down to a version that was easier for someone else to love, and I'd been doing it so gradually that I'd mistaken the shrinking for growing up, for maturity, for marriage, for compromise. My father, even from a spiral notebook on a nightstand, was the one who finally called it what it actually was. I stayed at that house for 3 days. I told Diane I needed time, and she texted back, "Take whatever time you need," which on paper looked supportive and underneath felt like distance dressed up as kindness. The same distance she'd offered through 8 months of chemo appointments and waiting rooms. I went through his closet. I found the unfinished workshop project, half a birdhouse he'd been building for my sister's kids. I found a photo of me at 6 years old, crying after I struck out in Little League, and on the back, in his handwriting, "Best day." He let it all out and played the next inning anyway. By the third night, sitting alone at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, I made a decision that didn't feel dramatic in the moment, though it would turn out to be the most important one of my adult life. I wasn't going to ask Diane to change who she fundamentally was, but I was done asking myself to disappear in order to keep a peace that had never actually been peaceful. Whatever happened next, I was done being quiet about what I needed. My father hadn't raised a man to bury himself slowly just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation at someone else's dinner table. I came home on the 4th day and found Diane at the kitchen island, scrolling her phone, a glass of wine half-finished beside her. She looked up and said, "You're back," in a tone that managed to sound both relieved and slightly accusatory, like I'd inconvenienced her by grieving on my own schedule instead of hers. I sat down across from her and said the thing I'd been rehearsing in my head for 3 days straight. "I need to talk about what happened at the funeral." She sighed, actually sighed, the kind of exhale that precedes someone explaining to you why your feelings are an overreaction. "Can we please not relive that? It was a hard day for everyone." I told her it wasn't a hard day for everyone. It was a hard day for me, specifically, and she'd made it harder, on purpose, in front of her entire family. She crossed her arms. "I was trying to help you not make a scene. My family has a certain way of doing things, and I was raised to." I cut her off, gently, but I cut her off. "Your family didn't raise you to be cold," I said. "They raised you to be afraid of looking anything other than fine. That's not the same thing as composure. That's just fear wearing a nice dress." I watched something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe, or just surprise that I'd said something with that much edge to it. "So now I'm the villain," she said, "because I didn't want my husband sobbing on the ground in front of 40 people? I told her that I wasn't trying to make her a villain. I was trying to tell her, as clearly as I knew how, that the moment she chose to manage my grief instead of share it, she told me something true about our marriage that I could no longer pretend not to have heard. She got quiet at that. Not soft quiet. Defensive quiet, the kind that precedes an argument rather than ends one. We went back and forth for almost 2 hours that night. She brought up things from years back. Times she felt embarrassed by something I said at a work function, a comment I'd made about her mother once that I genuinely regretted. Fair points, some of them. I wasn't a perfect husband walking into that conversation with clean hands, and I told her that too. But none of it answered the actual question sitting between us, the one I finally said out loud around midnight. "Do you see my emotions as something dangerous? Something you have to control before they embarrass you? Because that's what 12 years has felt like, and I need an honest answer, not a defense." She didn't have an answer that night. She said she needed to think, and I told her I needed space to think too. I packed a bag and drove back to my father's house, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself this wasn't the kind of decision that ends a marriage, just the kind that tests whether one is actually built to hold real weight. Lying in my childhood bedroom that night, in a bed too short for me now, I stared at the ceiling and wondered, for the first time in 12 years, whether the quietest, most honest version of myself even had a place in the marriage I'd built. It was not a comfortable question. It was, I think, the most necessary one I'd ever asked myself. I spent the better part of a week at my father's house, going through the motions of settling an estate that didn't have much to settle, a paid-off house, an old truck, a workshop full of tools that smelled like a childhood I was grateful for. Diane called twice a day at first, then once. Then we settled into a strange rhythm of short texts that said nothing real. I used that week to do something I probably should have done years earlier. I tried, honestly, to understand where her fear of feeling had actually come from, instead of just resenting the shape it took. I remembered something Diane told me once, early in our relationship, almost in passing. She was 12 when her father died, suddenly, a heart attack at his desk. Eleanor didn't cry in front of the children. Eleanor hosted the funeral reception herself, in heels, making sure the caterers had enough ice, and told a young Diane, "We don't fall apart in front of guests. We fall apart later, privately, if at all." Diane told me this once like it was an interesting fact about her childhood. It took me 12 years and my own father's funeral to understand it was actually the blueprint for every wall she'd built since. That didn't excuse what happened at the church. I want to be clear about that, because there's a version of this story where understanding someone's wound becomes an excuse for the way they keep reopening yours, and I wasn't interested in writing that version. Context isn't the same as permission. Diane learned, as a child, that grief was something you managed in private and performed competence in public. She'd been doing exactly that her whole adult life, and it had worked for her, mostly, until it collided with a husband whose father taught him the opposite lesson at the exact same age. There was a night that week, the lowest one, where I genuinely considered that this might be the end. I sat in my father's garage, the radio on low, doing nothing in particular with my hands, and let myself imagine an actual future without her. Not out of anger. Out of a kind of clear, cold clarity that scared me more than any argument we'd had. I thought about what it would mean to spend the rest of my life with someone who saw my softest moments as liabilities. I thought about whether love that requires you to hide half of yourself is actually love, or just a very long, very comfortable negotiation. I thought about my sister, who'd been divorced for 2 years by then, and how she'd told me once that the worst part wasn't the ending. It was realizing how many years she'd spent translating herself into a language her ex-husband never bothered learning. I didn't want that to be my sentence too, but I wasn't sure yet how to avoid it. I didn't reach a conclusion that night. I want to be honest about that too. There was no lightning bolt, no movie moment where the answer arrived fully formed. There was just a tired man in a garage, missing his father, scared of his marriage, trying to figure out if the life he'd built was a life or just a very well-furnished compromise. I went to bed that night without an answer. I just knew, for the first time, that I was finally willing to ask the question out loud, to her, and actually listen to where it landed. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. I say that because stories like this one only mean something if we're willing to sit in them together, honestly, without rushing to the easy ending. And this one doesn't have an easy ending. It has a real one, which took longer to get to. Diane showed up at my father's house on a Sunday, unannounced, which she'd never done in 12 years of marriage. She always called first, always managed the approach, the same way she managed everything. She stood on the porch in jeans I'd almost never seen her wear, no makeup, looking like someone who hadn't slept particularly well. She asked if she could come in, and I let her. She didn't apologize right away. She walked through the house first, slowly, looking at things. The birdhouse my father never finished. The photo on the wall of him teaching me to drive. Both of us laughing at something the camera didn't catch. She picked up the spiral notebook, which I'd left out on the kitchen table, and asked if she could read it. I told her she could. I watched her face while she did, and somewhere around the 3rd page, her composure, that word again, finally cracked. "I talked to my mother this week," she said, setting the notebook down carefully, like it was something fragile. "I asked her why we never just fell apart, why everything always had to look fine. She told me Eleanor's answer, which was almost word for word what Diane had told me years ago about the funeral reception and the ice for the caterers. "I think I've been doing the same thing to you that was done to me," she said. "I think I learned that love means managing the room, not sitting in the mess with someone. And I did that to you at the worst possible moment of your life, in front of people who already didn't respect where you came from. I am so sorry. Not because you got upset, because I made you feel like the realest, most human thing about you needed to be hidden." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I'd waited 12 years, in some ways, to hear something close to that sentence, and now that it had arrived, I wasn't going to rush past it just to make the moment more comfortable. I asked her, plainly, what she thought needed to change, not in some abstract future sense, but specifically, starting now. She said she didn't fully know yet, but she knew the answer wasn't going back to exactly what we'd had before. She said she wanted to learn how to sit next to my feelings instead of standing over them with instructions. She said it slowly, like she was trying the words on for the first time and wasn't sure yet if they fit, and I believed her more for that hesitation than I would have believed a speech rehearsed in the car on the way over. It wasn't a fix. I want to say that clearly because I don't believe in fixes that arrive in a single conversation on a porch. But it was the first true thing either of us had said to each other in longer than I could remember. And after the year I'd had, true was worth more to me than easy. We sat at my father's kitchen table until it got dark outside, neither of us reaching for the light switch, just talking, the way I used to talk with my hands before I learned which version of myself got invited places. We didn't move back into our old house for another 2 months. I stayed at my father's place, fixing up the things he'd never gotten to, finished the birdhouse, repainted the porch railing he'd been meaning to redo for 3 summers. Diane came out most weekends, not performing anything, just showing up, sometimes with takeout, sometimes just to sit in the workshop while I worked, learning, slowly, how to be present in a room with feelings she couldn't manage or fix. We didn't tell her family any of this for a while. When we finally did, Eleanor's response was about what you'd expect, a long pause, a comment about airing things out unnecessarily. But something had shifted in Diane by then. She told her mother, calmly, that she loved her and that she also wasn't going to raise her own future children on the same instructions she'd been raised on. Eleanor didn't fully understand. I'm not sure she ever will. But Diane didn't need her to anymore. We're still married. I won't pretend this story ends with a clean, easy bow, because real marriages don't get those, not the ones worth having anyway. What we have now is different from what we had before, slower, more honest, occasionally still clumsy. I still catch her, sometimes, instinctively reaching for composure when something hard lands in the room. But now she catches herself too, and she reaches for my hand instead. Last month, at her cousin's wedding, I got choked up during the toast, remembering my own backyard wedding and my father walking me down the aisle. And instead of a hand gripping my shoulder too hard, I felt her fingers find mine under the table, steady, no words attached to it at all. My father used to say feeling something all the way through was the only thing that ever made him big. I used to think he meant something philosophical. I think now he just meant this, that a life only really belongs to you once you stop editing it for an audience. I buried a man who taught me that lesson twice. Once with his hands, for 30 years. Once with a spiral notebook, after he was already gone. If this story found something in you tonight, do me a favor. Follow this channel, and if you can, send it to 5 people who might need to hear it the way you did. Leave a comment below, not a polite one, an honest one. Tell me about a moment you were told to be smaller than you actually felt. And tell me what story you want to hear next, because these stories only work if we keep telling them together. I'll see you in the next one.